How were the Americas formed? Not the land, the people. The first human beings ever to set foot here, and how two empty continents filled up until they were empty no longer. For almost 100 years, the answer was simple. Around 13,000 years ago, a band of hunters crossed from Asia into Alaska, slipped south through a gap in the ice, and became the first Americans. One crossing, one road, one people, open and shut. It's also wrong, or, closer to the truth, it's the last page of the story, handed to us as if it were the first. Because there are human footprints in the New Mexico desert that are around 23,000 years old, almost 10,000 years older than the first Americans were ever supposed to exist. And the moment you pull on that one thread, the whole neat little map starts to come apart in your hands. So how did people really get here, when the entire top of the continent was a wall of ice? Which road did they take? And why does almost everything you were taught about the first Americans keep falling apart? To answer that, we have to go back to the real beginning. And the real beginning isn't here. Northeast Asia, more than 30,000 years ago. This is where the story of the first Americans actually starts, and it starts with a split. By reading DNA pulled from ancient bones, scientists can now watch old populations branch apart over time, like limbs growing off a tree. And one of those branches, the founding line of nearly every native people in the Americas, broke away from its East Asian relatives around 36,000 years ago. Here is the first thing the simple map gets wrong. That split did not send anyone rushing into Alaska. Nothing about this was fast. For thousands of years, the founding population held together as a single, distinct group before a single foot ever touched the New World. They were waiting on something. And what they were waiting on is a piece of geography that does not exist anymore. During the Ice Age, so much of the world's water was frozen into the ice sheets that the oceans dropped, and the seafloor between Siberia and Alaska rose up into dry land. Not the narrow little bridge you're picturing. A vast, frozen plain, hundreds of miles wide, a cold country of its own. Geographers call it Beringia, and the first Americans did not hurry across it. They moved in. For thousands of years, they lived there, pinned between two walls, Asia at their backs, an unbroken sheet of ice blocking the rest of the Americas ahead. This was no quick layover. It was long enough for a whole population to adapt to one of the harshest environments human beings have ever survived, and long enough for their DNA to drift in its own direction and set them apart as a distinct people. Genetics even catches a pulse of ancestry from another ancient northern group flowing into them somewhere around 25 to 20,000 years ago while they waited. Scientists call this long pause the Beringian standstill. And around 22,000 to 18,000 years ago, one line, the ancient Beringians, broke off from the rest. One warning here, because this is where the science gets abused. DNA tells us about ancestry and population history, who is related to whom, and roughly when ancient groups split. It does not define anyone's culture or identity, and it never replaces what's buried in the ground. It narrows the possibilities. It doesn't tell the whole story, but it tells us this. While these people sat frozen in the north, the old map says the entire Americas to the south were empty. Not one human being, for thousands of years still to come. And that is the exact moment the footprints appear. White Sands, New Mexico. The cracked bed of a lake that dried up long ago. Picture it as it was then. A shallow lake on a cold, open plain. its edges soft with mud, and people moving along the shore, leaving prints that were buried, hardened into stone, and uncovered again in our own lifetime. When scientists worked out what they were looking at, it set off one of the biggest fights in modern archaeology. The first time researchers put a date on those footprints, in 2021, the numbers stopped the field cold. The tracks were left during the Last Glacial Maximum, the most brutal peak of the entire Ice Age, when more of the planet's water was locked up in ice than at any other moment in the human story. By the old map, the Americas were supposed to stay empty for thousands of years after that. Yet here were people, walking a lakeshore in New Mexico, right in the teeth of it. Other scientists challenged the date, and fairly. It leaned on ancient seeds, and seeds from water plants can soak up old carbon and read as older than they really are. So the team went back and dated the site again, with methods that do not carry that flaw: pollen. And a technique that measures the last time a grain of sand saw sunlight before it was buried. In 2023, the new dates landed in the same window. In 2025, a study of the old lake's own geology backed it up a third time. Let me be exact, because this is where people overreach. White Sands does not prove the precise day the first humans arrived. What it proves is narrower and much harder to dodge. Human beings were standing in New Mexico deep south of the ice, around 23,000 to 21,000 years ago. And that one fact is enough to tear the old story in half. Not because of the footprints themselves, but because of how those people were supposed to have reached that spot in the first place. Go back to that gap in the ice, the one on the simple map. It is real. It is called the ice-free corridor, the passage that opened between the two enormous ice sheets over Canada as they finally melted apart. There is just one problem with using it to explain White Sands. The dates are impossible. The corridor did not open until around 13,800 years ago, and even then it stayed a barren, lifeless scar, with nothing to eat along the way, until closer to 13,200. So if people were already in New Mexico 22,000 years ago, the road they supposedly walked was sealed shut for another 8,000 years. They could not have come that way. Full stop. So, they came by water. The leading idea is a route down the Pacific coast, sometimes called the Kelp Highway. While the inland route was a wall of ice, the outer coast was alive. People could move along the shoreline, partly by boat and partly on foot, living off kelp beds, fish, seals, and shellfish, sliding past the ice along the edge of the sea. It fits the timing of White Sands perfectly. It also comes with a cruel catch, and it is the reason this argument never seems to end. When the Ice Age finished and the ice melted, the sea rose and drowned that entire ancient coastline. The camps, the beaches, the burials, the proof, almost all of it now sits underwater, far off the modern shore. So the most likely road into the Americas is also one of the hardest places on the planet to excavate. The best evidence may be lying in the dark, on a drowned coast, where almost no one can reach it. So if the ground itself is drowned and silent, where do you look next? Strangely enough, the answer was waiting back inside the DNA we started with. Quick thing before we go on. If a story built carefully from the evidence is what you come here for, take a second and subscribe. Lost evidence lives in exactly these questions. So, back to the DNA, because it had one more thing to say. The founding population had been one group up in the north, but from around 17,000 to 14,600 years ago, It split into the two great branches that would become most of the native peoples of North and South America. And that split happened south of the ice. Line that up against the calendar one more time. The corridor did not open until around 13,800 years ago. But people had already crossed south and split into separate populations before it did. They were not waiting at a gate in the north. They were already inside, already spreading, already becoming distinct peoples in distinct places. And if that is true, then somewhere out there in the dirt, there should be the tools, the bones, and the traces they left behind. All of it. Older than Clovis. So is there? There is. A whole ladder of it. Climb it from the bottom. Oldest first. Idaho. A site called Cooper's Ferry, known to the Nez Perce as Nipahe. People camped there over and over, leaving behind unfluted, stemmed stone points, part of what is called the Western Stemmed Tradition, a way of making tools with roots reaching back toward Northeast Asia. The oldest layers run to roughly 16,500 to 15,300 years ago. That is older than the ice-free corridor by thousands of years, which means whoever camped at Cooper's Ferry could not have reached it through the middle of the continent. The tools are the proof here, a place lived in and returned to again and again. Now jump clear across the continent. Florida, an underwater sinkhole in a river called Page-ladson. Divers working in the dark water pulled up stone tools lying beside the butchered bones of a mastodon, an Ice Age relative of the elephant, dated to about 14,500 years ago. People hunting or scavenging giants in the far southeastern corner of the continent, thousands of years before Clovis was supposed to exist. And the evidence there suggests humans and those great animals shared the land for around 2,000 years before the animals finally vanished. Back west. Oregon. The Paisley Caves, where the evidence turned stranger and far more human. No weapons this time. Dried human waste. Coprolites, around 12,400 radiocarbon years old, confirmed as human by the chemical biomarkers preserved inside them. Not a tool somebody made that another culture could have left behind. A trace. A living body left in the same caves as some of the oldest stemmed tools on the continent. And Texas. The Deborah L. Friedkin site at Buttermilk Creek, where more than 15,000 stone tools and flakes came out of the ground in a layer sitting directly beneath the Clovis layer. Beneath it. Stratigraphy, that clean is very hard to argue with. The lower layer dates between roughly 13,200 years ago and 15,500 years ago, older than the Clovis tools resting right on top of it. It doesn't prove Clovis was invented in Texas. It supports something quieter and more interesting, that Clovis grew out of older tool-making traditions that were already living here, on this continent, before it. Now look at the whole ladder at once. Footprints in New Mexico, tools in Idaho, a butchered mastodon in Florida, human waste in Oregon, a buried toolkit under Texas. 5 kinds of evidence, gathered by 5 completely different methods, scattered clear across the continent. And that variety is the entire point. If everything rested on one method, one shared mistake could topple all of it at once. But footprints prove a body was physically there. Tools prove a way of life. Coprolites prove a living person. And independent dating pins every piece of it to the calendar. Standing alone, any one of these could be doubted. Lined up together, found by different teams, dated by different methods, all pointing the same direction, they are almost impossible to wave away. People were here. They were spread out, and they were here long before Clovis. Which leaves a brutal question. If the Americas were already full of people, then what on earth was Clovis? Clovis got its name back in the 1930s from a set of distinctive fluted stone points first dug up near Clovis, New Mexico. Once archaeologists knew the shape to look for, they started finding the points everywhere, coast to coast, almost all of them around 13,000 years old. And for a long time, nothing older turned up underneath them. So the conclusion seemed obvious. Whoever made these points was first. That single style had spread fast and far, and it left such a loud, recognizable signal in so many places that for nearly a century, everyone mistook the loudest evidence for the earliest. Clovis points are everywhere because Clovis worked. But loudest is not the same as first. That buried toolkit under Texas even hints that Clovis grew out of older traditions already here. Clovis didn't arrive to found the Americas. It rose up inside a hemisphere that was already, quietly, full. And reframing Clovis opens one last door. Because the most famous site that ever proved people beat Clovis to it, the one that broke the whole old model wide open, is sitting at the center of a scientific brawl happening right now. Monte Verde in southern Chile, near the bottom of South America, about as far from the Alaskan land bridge as a human being can physically travel in the Americas. For decades, it was the hammer that shattered Clovis first. Beautifully preserved, dated to around 14,500 years ago. And the logic was hard to beat. If people had reached the far south of South America by then, they must have entered the continents and crossed that staggering distance even earlier. There was no fitting that into a Clovis arrival at 13,000. Then, in 2026, a team led by the researcher Surovel published a study in the journal Science, arguing that Monte Verde is far younger than anyone believed, maybe only 8,000 to 4,000 years old. Within weeks, around 30 other researchers fired back, defending the older date and arguing that the new study had read the site wrong. I'll be straight with you. Right now, it is not resolved, and I am leaving it unresolved on purpose, because that is the honest truth of it. Monte Verde has not been debunked, and it has not been confirmed. It is a live fight among serious scientists, and proof that this entire field is still shifting under our feet as we speak, which dares an obvious question. If the dates can swing this hard, why not just believe the wildest claims out there? Because there is a hard line between a fight among experts and a claim with nothing underneath it, and holding that line is what keeps the rest of this honest. You'll hear that humans were in California 130,000 years ago from a site called Suruti, where broken mastodon bones and a few stones were read as the work of people. There are no tools, no human remains, nothing that survives a hard look. You'll hear that Ice Age Europeans crossed the Atlantic to become the first Americans, the Solutrean idea, unsupported by the archaeology and flatly contradicted by the DNA, which ties early Americans to Asia, not Europe. You'll hear flat claims of people here 100,000 years ago resting on nothing at all. None of it belongs in the real chain of evidence. Knowing what to throw out is exactly what makes the rest worth trusting. So, how were the Americas formed? Not with one crossing, one road, or one perfect moment. It started with a founding people in Northeast Asia, who split from their East Asian relatives around 36,000 years ago. It ran through thousands of years of waiting in the drowned land of Beringia, where they lived in isolation and broke into branches. It pushed south before the inland corridor ever opened, almost certainly down a Pacific coast that lies underwater today, leaving footprints in New Mexico in the deepest cold of the Ice Age, more than 20,000 years ago. From there it spread and fast to Idaho by 16,000 years ago, to Florida by 14,500 years ago, into deserts, swamps, caves, and river valleys, scattering tools and traces across 2 whole continents. People adapting to wildly different worlds, far apart, a long time before any spear point named Clovis ever appeared. And only near the very end of all of it did that technology spread so well that we mistook it for the beginning. The first Americans arrived earlier, spread wider, and adapted faster than the old map ever allowed. The textbook was not lying to us. It was just holding up the last page of a very long story and calling it the first. Which brings us right back to those footprints in the New Mexico mud. Tracks left by a person walking the shore of a vanished lake more than 20,000 years ago, someone who had no idea they would end up standing in the middle of an argument we still have not settled. If that drowned Pacific coast really was the first road into the Americas, and almost all of it now sits beneath the ocean, will we ever be able to truly prove it? Or is the most important chapter of this whole story already lost for good? Picture the person who left those footprints at White Sands on that shore more than 20,000 years ago. What do you think they were doing there that day? Leave your answers in the comments. And when you're ready for more, click the video on screen for more lost evidence.